Good evening. So this is the first lecture of a series of lectures given by our English teacher assistants and organized by Professor Michele El Kadri that are going to happen this year. The lecture is going to last about 1 hour. It is going to be carried out in English. And at the end, you have time to ask questions either in Portuguese or in English. It is a pleasure to have you all here. We hope you enjoy the presentation titled On Building Global Memory, the Politics of Silence on the Brazilian Military Dictatorship. And now I will briefly introduce your presenter, Lara. So, Lara Norgaard is a journalist, a literary translator, an educator, originally from the state of Colorado in the USA. In 2017, she received her undergraduate degree from Princeton University in comparative literature with a focus on Latin America. For her senior thesis, she compared post-dictatorship memory in 1990s detective fiction from Brazil and Argentina. The project led her to create Artememoria, a digital free access magazine about art and the memory of authoritarianism in Brazil, funded by Princeton's postgraduate Labuiz Fellowship. Artememoria is published in English and launches bi-yearly issues that discuss art, historical memory, and the continuities in state violence in Brazil for an international audience. Currently, the magazine's first issue, centered on the theme of witness testimony, is available online at artememoria.org. In addition to her work as the editor of Artememoria, Lara has reported on forced housing displacements in Rio de Janeiro with the Brazilian investigative journalism organization Agência Pública. Her translators of narrative nonfiction have appeared in the magazine Assinto Journal, for which she is also currently an editor at large. Lara is here with us as well with a Fulbright grant assistant teaching English, Letras Inglês. She has started new programs at the university, including a book club of global literature of resistance and the academic writing support program. You can find more information about those initiatives and how to get involved online at IDE website. And now, Lara is here to talk to you about a fundamental concept behind the first issue of Artememoria, the acts of witnessing state violence and the ways in which witnessing can be silenced to prevent a country or even the world from remembering.
Thank you so much. Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for coming here and spending your Thursday evening listening to me speak about this. I really appreciate it. Just to reiterate, I'm going to be speaking in English. But if at any point something I say is not clear, feel free to ask a question. You can just pause and ask a clarifying question. And then at the end, we'll have more time for larger conceptual questions or comments, and those can be done in either Portuguese or English. So it's most important is that you guys feel free to participate in any way that you'd like to during or after the lecture. As Felipe introduced, I'm going to be talking about the concept of witness testimony, and the title of this lecture is On Building Global Memory. You might be asking yourselves a few questions from just that title, and I hope you can read them. But the first is, what is this global memory, this idea of global memory that she's mentioning? It seems like a very broad concept. And it's a term that I use to talk about when the whole world seems to have knowledge about an event that took place, even if it was outside of their region or their home country. So raise your hands, guys, if you know something about the Holocaust. Does anyone here know something about the Holocaust? Yeah, okay, so most of you do, right? Raise your hands if you know something about apartheid South Africa. Right, exactly. Now, those are examples of events in the past, horrendous events in the past, that have a sort of global memory. People from way beyond those regions actually remember what took place at that time, right? But that's not necessarily the case with other instances of violence. So, for example, with the Brazilian military dictatorship, if you talk to someone from, let's say, Germany, who's never decided to study Brazil before, they might not know that Brazil even had a dictatorship. Right? So part of the question I'm trying to pose here is, why do we remember some events in the past more than others? How does memory circulate? You might be asking why I'm talking about this in terms of the Brazilian military dictatorship in the first place. And I'll get to a fuller explanation of the reason soon, but it's because I really do think that it deserves a larger, more global audience, that it has relevance beyond the immediate Brazilian context. And finally, you might be asking yourselves, why is this North American talking about the Brazilian military dictatorship in English? Maybe someone who's Brazilian should be talking about it in Portuguese. And all of that connects exactly to what I'm trying to say about global memory. Because basically, I believe that a North American audience should have an awareness of this topic. And in order for a North American audience and an international audience to have that awareness, we need to start talking about it in English. Because, like it or not, that is a global lingua franca, and it gives that wider audience. But now let me get in a little bit more to why this topic is actually of global relevance. So hopefully you can see this map here. This map, yes? Everyone can see it? Cool. Okay, so if we look at the dark green, these countries are Brazil, Bolivia, Paraguay, Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile. And all of them in the second half of the 20th century had a dictatorship that functioned along the lines of the national security doctrine, or Doutrina de Segurança Nacional. And I'll get to the other colors in a second. But does anyone know what the national security doctrine was? Okay, so the national security doctrine was an idea that a state needs to protect itself, in quotation marks, against an internal enemy. Internal enemy inside the country, which at this period of time was viewed as the leftist. Communist, socialist, any worker who seemed somewhat associated with communism or socialisms, that meant people who were involved in unions, in any sort of collective action, or in any sort of project of economic justice. And the idea was that those people were a threat, they were going to take over the countries, and that therefore the state needed to make sure that they couldn't do that. The way that they made sure that those internal enemies wouldn't be able to take over the country was through this plan called Operation Condor, which was originally developed by the United States through the CIA, and it was a plan of coordinated military actions by the government to oppress their own citizens to make sure that this wouldn't happen. Okay, so to sum up, this whole set of countries in green here all were organized in the second half of the 20th century around an ideology that the United States started. The United States used to convince these countries to oppress their own citizens, right? These countries in light green collaborated a little bit, but they didn't have a dictatorship that functioned directly in that sense. And so all of these countries during their dictatorships had ideological, economic, political, technical, and sometimes even military support from the United States. In the US, the most commonly known example of that is the military coup in Chile, which overthrew the democratically elected president Salvador Allende and put in Pinochet. But there was support by the US actively in all of these other countries. What I'm trying to get at here is that the Brazilian military dictatorship is not something that's just limited to Brazil, right? This is something that's clearly relevant on a regional level. I mean, these dictatorships collaborated actively. Like, Brazil even occasionally sent troops over the border into Argentina. They communicated actively, they traded strategies. So this is regionally relevant. And then it's also more internationally relevant. It's certainly relevant to the US, because the US was part of the cause of what happened in that period of time. And because it kind of fit into this Cold War logic of avoiding Soviet influence, of trying to stop the spread of communism around the world, this is actually a very globally relevant instance of state violence. But it's not really remembered that way, right? So I have some questions for you guys. Question number one. Who here studied the military dictatorship in high school? Raise your hands. Okay, good. Smattering of people. Did you study it for how long, more or less? 2 months? 2 months? Okay. Cool. Do you feel like you have a good handle over what happened during the dictatorship? I'm seeing no. In high school, no? Okay. Okay. Have you guys ever met someone who defended the military dictatorship, who said it was a good thing for Brazil? Raise your hands if yes. I want to see visually in this room. Okay, that's a lot of hands. All right. Or someone who said it wasn't that bad. Yeah, I've heard that a lot. Yeah. So, okay, I don't really, I mean, it's not very much a surprise, but I don't run in extreme right-wing circles in Brazil. And I, in just 2 months here, met 2 people who had long conversations with me about why the dictatorship was not a dictatorship in this country. I was very fast for a foreigner to have those conversations. And even traveling outside of Brazil, I've heard people from the region, from Argentina and from Chile, tell me that the reason why no one talks about the Brazilian dictatorship is that comparatively, it wasn't that bad. So that's another kind of discourse that's in the air there. Again, kind of justifying the fact that no one talks about the dictatorship. And finally, do you guys think that foreigners know about the dictatorship, generally speaking? No. I mean, I studied it, so obviously I know about it. But even in my university, Princeton, which is a very good institution in the United States, even there, people who knew about the Argentinian dictatorship did not know that Brazil had a dictatorship, right? So if we think about how memory travels and how you could have a global memory, right, where people around the world are aware, you could have a regional memory, let's say people around South America are aware, you have a national memory where people around a whole country are aware of what happened. And you have a marginal memory where only some groups within a particular country are aware of what happened. I would say that the Brazilian dictatorship falls into the final category. It's kind of only marginally remembered because there are a lot of people here in Brazil who have this idea that it wasn't really bad, and people around the region don't know about it, foreigners, etc. So, what I want to talk about today is one of my ideas of why that is. It's built on some other theorists' work. And then also talk about how, in context of the silencing of memory, the silencing of witnesses, how art can intervene and create and support a kind of marginal memory that does exist. And a quick so those are the major questions of the talk here. Why is this marginal, and what is the role of art in building awareness and memory? Quick shameless plug, this lecture comes from sort of based on an article that I wrote for the first issue of the magazine Artememoria. And so if you guys are interested in what you hear today, I totally encourage that you go and read, or there's even a video you can watch, of other ideas and theories related to similar topics. And it's all available online at artememoria.org. I also, for the first issue, we did one print edition, which was exciting. So this is it. I'm going to pass it around now so you guys have a chance to flip through it as I speak. Okay, without further ado, let's start talking about this. So let's start with the concept of witnessing is the core base concept that I want to start this on, because I think it's fundamental to understanding why there's a lack of memory in Brazil about this period. What do you guys think it means to witness an event? I want to hear your thoughts. What does witnessing, like if you're going to testimoniar something, right? What does that mean? Be present. Nice. Any other thoughts? That you saw something, so it has to do with sight also. Any other thoughts? Okay, those are very good. That you're present and that you saw something. In other words, that you were physically there, right? And you were there when this thing took place. It's this idea of being present in space and time when an event occurs, right? And that carries a lot of power, at least in the way our society is structured right now, especially in Western society. Like Western culture really places value on sight, right? When you see something, it's a very valued experience. And so witness testimony carries a lot of weight, right? It's what's used in a court of law as evidence. People's witness testimony is evidence. It's also the basis of journalistic reporting, right? A source is someone who was witness to something. And if they didn't witness something, it's hearsay. It doesn't really count, right? So there's a lot of power in the idea of witnessing. And there's a theorist in media studies, North American theorist named John D. Peters, and he expands on this concept. So he establishes this idea of the intersection between being present in time and being present in space. But he says that there are other acts of communication, especially in the digital age, that can carry the attitude of witnessing. And that might sound confusing, but it will get clear in just a minute. So the more something has the attitude of witnessing is when it's closer in time and space to the event that occurred. I'm going to give some examples because on the abstract level, it's a bit vague. He makes this very helpful chart. Can everyone see this? Okay. So, present in space and present in time. He says this is being there. That means when you literally witness something. Like you guys being here, you are witnessing me lecturing about this topic, right? That's happening right now. But then, if you are absent in space, not physically here, but present in time, he calls that live transmission. Basically, what he means is like live TV. A live TV broadcast would be a great example of this, right? So you're watching something as it happens, but you're not physically there. But it still sort of feels like you witnessed it. For me, a really powerful example of that was when Donald Trump won the 2016 presidential election. I was not physically where anyone was counting votes, right? But I saw that happen on television. And I felt that happen. And it felt like I had just witnessed something, right? So even though you're not physically there and you're not physically seeing it in the place, it still feels like witnessing. Now, you can also be present in space and absent in time. And Peters calls that the idea of historicity. Has anyone here been to the Memorial de Resistencia in Sao Paulo? Yes, okay, one person. That's Brazil's only site of memory about the last military dictatorship. And it's a site of memory because it is physically in the building of the Dores in Sao Paulo. So building where torture happened, right? Where murders took place. And you walk through it, and in a way you can kind of feel that in the space itself. When you walk into a room and someone tells you, this is where X many people died, or this is where this many people were tortured, you feel that, because it's in the space somehow, right? There are also a lot of these sorts of sites of memory related to concentration camps with the Holocaust. If you go to Auschwitz, everyone says it's a very powerful experience. It carries that kind of attitude of witnessing, right? And then Peter says that when you're absent in space and you're absent in time, it's just a secondhand document. It doesn't carry that kind of power. So you read a history book. It can be very interesting, it can be very powerful, you can be very engaged, but it's not going to feel like you've witnessed something. And it also doesn't carry the same kind of credibility. And then Peter says that art doesn't even go in this chart, right? Because he says that the fact that the facts change, in addition to being absent in time and absent in space, means that it can't carry any sense of witnessing. Now, okay, so on some level, this makes sense. It lines up with my personal experiences, at least, to a certain degree. But on another level, I don't agree with Peters. And I think it's because he assumes the context of an ideal liberal democracy where nothing is altered, nothing is hidden. The state doesn't try to silence anything. Everything is perfectly even and open. So the media functions perfectly. Spaces of past violence are open and visible to the entire world. And then, in that case, being present in space, it makes sense that it would carry witnessing, more so than a workbook. But I'm going to explain to you why I don't think this works, not even in the United States. Because the United States is not a perfect democracy in any way, shape, or form. And I don't think witnessing works in this even-keeled way that Peters describes. So starting with the idea of being there, presence in space, presence in time. Here I have a picture of Eric Garner. Does anyone know who Eric Garner is? Yes. Okay, yes over there. Looking at my North Americans up there. Eric Garner was a black man who was murdered by white police officers in the United States. He was taken into a chokehold, which is illegal, and he was pushed onto the ground. The medical examiner's report says he was strangled to death. And there were also many witnesses. The witnesses said that he repeatedly said, "I can't breathe," to the police officer, and the police officer continued to choke him, right? There's also a video that shows him saying, "I can't breathe." This is a screenshot from the video. So the thing is, this police officer went to court, he went to trial, and he was not indicted. This was not viewed as murder, despite the fact that there were so many witnesses saying it was. So clearly, the fact that you witnessed something, that you were there, that you saw it, doesn't necessarily carry the same weight for every witness, based on the justice system that it is involved in, right? Now let's talk about live transmission. Here it's a little bit difficult to see, but this is a screenshot of a tweet. It is now deleted by an account with like around 73,000 Twitter followers, so major Twitter account. And when Trump was doing a rally in Phoenix, Arizona, this person tweeted a photo that he said was from the rally. And he said, "Massive crowd waiting outside for the Trump rally in Phoenix. But, media says everyone hates Trump. I'm confused. Hashtag Phoenix rally." So, in some way this is live transmission. It's not by an official media outlet, but someone is tweeting something as it takes place, right? And 73,000 people are seeing this and thinking that this is a Trump rally that's taking place. But guess what? Not a photo from a Trump rally. This was a photo from, there was a basketball game in Cleveland. Yeah, not the crowd that was at Trump's rally. But basically what I'm trying to say here is that the live transmission of events and the credibility of that powerful aspect of it, powerful aspect of witnessing comes from its credibility. We think it's true because someone was there, someone saw it. It's a photo of the rally, but it's not, right? When there's fake news, misinformation, or media bias, live transmission is not necessarily the most compelling way of witnessing events at all. Now let's go to historicity. This is a photo of the statue of Robert E. Lee in the University of Virginia campus in Charlottesville. University of anyway. So, does anyone know what the Confederacy was in the United States? The Confederacy, I'm seeing a few nods, but I'll explain. The Confederacy was the part of the country that during the U.S. Civil War supported slavery, wanted slavery, fought for slavery, right? This is a statue of one of the Confederacy's major generals and leaders. And it's celebrated in the U.S. South in a lot of areas still, right? So when you go to a lot of different cities in the South of the United States, rather than see a lot of information about slavery and the horrors that took place during that period in our history, you see a celebration of people in the country who actively supported that system of oppression. In other words, those spaces, even though you're in a space that had violence take place there, these sorts of statues and monuments erase those histories of violence. And you don't see them. So then the idea of witnessing in space sort of falls apart. And the absence of space, absence in time, we already said apparently does not hold any kind of witnessing. Now, all of these sorts of kind of twisting of witnessing or erasure of witnessing take place even more intensely in an authoritarian context, right? Because in the ways that silencing can take place in a country, basically, you can directly say to someone, don't speak. Or in the case of the United States, you can exclude and marginalize people enough that their testimony is silenced. So that's actually an idea by a philosopher, Ray Lincoln, who talks about this concept of silencing. And she indicates that silencing doesn't have to be the direct order to be silent. But during an authoritarian regime, oftentimes it is the direct order to be silent. And that can be even more intense. So if we were to look at this quadrant, again, in terms of dictatorship, what happened to witnesses who went inside these prisons and who were prisoners during the dictatorship? They were people who disappeared. Desaparecidos, right? That term, I think that term is like really telling, because you cease to exist. It's not that you're a prisoner, you are, but in terms of the discourse of the state and where people don't even know where you are, you cease to exist. The witness is gone, totally disappeared. In terms of live transmission, you have censorship of the media. Now, in the Brazilian military dictatorship between 1964 and 1968, that was more of a self-censorship in the mainstream media, so it wasn't as official. But after the Fifth Institutional Act in 1968, became extremely official. There was a direct order of you can't talk about certain things. You cannot print the word racism. That was one of the rules. You literally weren't even able to say that racism was a phenomenon that happened. You could definitely forget about talking about the critiquing the military or talking about disappearances or anything like that. That certainly wasn't allowed. So this kind of witnessing is largely gone. Of course, there's a resistance to this in the media. There were a lot of amazing independent publications, but only one survived the entire dictatorship, which was a humor magazine, BuzzFeed. Then we have historicity, presence in space and absence in time. What if you can see that prison? Even though no one is talking about it, you can see it. In a certain way, you're witnessing it, right? But the prisons during the Brazilian military dictatorship were hidden. They're clandestine detention centers. So a building that was supposedly one thing was actually acting as a prison. So sometimes these were government buildings, sometimes they were military facilities, sometimes they were even houses. There's a house in Petrópolis in the state of Rio that is called, nicknamed, I guess, Casa da Morte. Yeah. And today it's still just a normal house. There's not a single sign that indicates what happened there, right? So how are you supposed to, first of all, witness the violence that's going on as an everyday citizen when it's so hidden? Second of all, how are you supposed to remember there's still no marks on the spaces where these instances of violence take place? And then in recorded nonfiction, like books about what was going on at the time, those were also censored under the dictatorship. So in general, in all of this sort of like non-fiction witnessing under the dictatorship, you have a lot of difficulties getting things through, right? And so then the question comes in of, what about art? What about art in this kind of context? Art has a way of evading the censor, right? It can say what someone wants to, you can say what you want to say without directly saying it with art, in a way that you can't necessarily with other ways of doing things, right? So I think that art, in one way, plays that role. Can say what hasn't been said. I'm sorry, this is really good. But it says, what is art in the context of state science? That's basically the question that I discussed. So we can say what hasn't been said. And there was actually a genre that came about in Brazil during the military dictatorship called romance e reportagem, a reported novel, which discussed crimes that took place under the dictatorship, but changed the facts, changed the names, and so was able to get through the censor and pretended it was just like a murder mystery, when it was actually talking about something that really happened. So you have examples like that. You also have allegorical novels that talk on a, they're literally talking about the regime, but in a coded way. And you see this around the world. A lot of artists are actively involved in representing what cannot be witnessed, because witnessing has been silenced. So there's that. But I also think that art does something more. Art is not just the thing that comes in when you can't write a nonfiction piece, and it doesn't just like take the place of journalism. It doesn't just take the place of a news broadcast. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how it might be something more in an example of one novel from the Brazilian dictatorship, Artememoria by Felipe Trevisan, or the Murrow case. And my goal here is to talk about how art goes further than just witnessing while also witnessing. Okay? Has anyone read anything by Felipe Trevisan? Cool. Okay, some people. Has anyone read this novel? Okay, I highly recommend it. It's really weird, really good, very just like a strange book in the best way. It's actually Fonseca's first novel that he ever wrote, and it was published in 1973. It takes place in the 1970s, right? So it's taking place the same time that it's being written. So to make this clear, the way that the plot is structured is a story frame. A story frame is when there's a story within a story. Okay? Is everyone on board with that? All right, so I'm going to start by describing the story that's inside the story, and then I'll talk about the frame. Okay, so the main character of the story within the story is named Paulo Morel. He's a visual artist, he's the protagonist. He lives in Santa Teresa in Rio, the Bohemian neighborhood, especially Bohemian in the 70s, and he has this crazy living situation where he lives with, I don't remember the exact number of women, like I think at least 5, and they're all from different social statuses. So one is the daughter of an ambassador, and another is a woman who has to work as a prostitute to support a child because she has left home after her sister's husband raped her. So you have like a huge range of situations here. And it actually very quickly becomes very dark, this living situation. Because as much as the protagonist, Paulo Morel, likes to say it's like this perfect, modern Bohemian family, a lot of the women are there because of the really terrible situations that they're in their lives, and it's very clear that the man in the situation holds almost all of the power. And if the reader had any illusion about this being a positive situation or a negative one, that would quickly be dispelled because you find out very quickly that one of the residents of this modern family was murdered, her name was Joan, and possibly by Morel himself. So that's the story inside the story. It's very intense. And just by looking at that, we can kind of see how it witnesses the dictatorship in a way. And a lot of critics talk about how just in this inner story frame witnesses the dictatorship. It has this aesthetic of brutality. Everything that takes place in this book carries a sense of violence, which is something that only came about in Fonseca's writing when he started writing about the dictatorship in the 70s and after the Fifth Institutional Act. And in the way that he describes the violence that results from huge wealth gaps is kind of him painting this portrait of a Brazilian economic disaster, which runs directly in contrast to the narrative of the Brazilian economic miracle that the dictatorship was trying to push at the time. So rather than write a nonfiction piece about, look at what's happening to this country where there's so much inequality that's happening because of this economic miracle, this turn to neoliberalism, instead, Fonseca decides to describe it through his work. But he does more than that. This would be just the witnessing thing. I think he goes far beyond that because of the external story frame. So, the real narrator in this story frame is a man called Paulo Morel. So very similar to the name Paulo Morel, right? Now, he's a visual artist, and he's in jail because he's suspected of murdering a woman named Eloisa. All right, so he decides to write a novel while he's in prison, which is the story I just described to you about Pau Morel, who murders Joanna, who lives in like this bohemian household, right? So it seems like the story frame, the story outside the story, this one here, is another version of the story inside the story, right? It's another version of what Pau Morel is writing in prison. And then we have a character named Vilela, who's a writer who's supposed to be in jail, helping Pau Morel write his novel as he's imprisoned. And this Vilela ends up being the sort of detective who tries to solve the crime based on the fictional account of Pau Morel. Right. So it gets a little convoluted there because it's very meta, it's very referential. But basically, you have a man who's in prison, suspected of murder, who writes a story that seems to be the story of the murder that he himself committed. Right? In other words, Vilela, who's this detective, ends up helping solve the crime by reading the fiction that Pau Morel wrote. Right? So he's editing the text, he's changing the text, and at the same time he's investigating what happened based on this fictional text. What this is, that Ruben Fonseca is describing, is a world where there is no witnessing, where there is no first-hand evidence, there is no material evidence of this crime that was committed, right? There is absolutely no witnesses who bore witness to this woman's death. And all that this detective has access to is a fictional story. So, in other words, Ruben Fonseca is describing the very context that he's in, where there's no way of actually solving crimes. All that you have is Ruben Fonseca's novel, the novel itself. And the consequences are very dark. At the end of the book, Pau Morel is set free. He is not convicted. And this is a spoiler, I'm sorry. So instead, it's two poor people who get charged with this crime. One of them had a previous conviction as a thief. So therefore, he was already labeled as a criminal, and he must have been the one to do it. And one of the last lines of the book is, a thief is considered to be a bit more dangerous than an artist. Felix's conviction, Felix is a perfect ending to our story. We're going to forget that he's innocent. That's one of the final lines. So, I think that what this example shows is that art, yes, it has the power to witness, but more importantly, it has the power to comment on the way people witness, to comment on the dominant discourses that are in society, to comment on the way society works. So while reading about an event, you also read about the narratives that the government creates at that event, that any institution creates. It's this sort of meta level of the text that really gives art its power. And that, at least, is my argument about one of the reasons why art is important in this discussion of witnessing, even though a lot of theorists have really left it on the wayside. But what else does art have the power to do? Well, it has to do with memory. Because this is all talking about actively witnessing something as it happens. That was sort of the discussion that I was talking about. But art also has a lot to do with memory, especially in contexts in which memory is erased just as witnessing was erased at the time when it occurred. So I want to give some quick background to memory after the dictatorship ended in Brazil. And I kind of alluded to it before, but here are a few more details. Okay? So, in Brazil, there have been no trials against people who committed crimes during the military dictatorship. No trials against people who were torturers or who murdered people, right? And the first National Truth Commission, 2011. Let's compare this to Argentina. Argentina, its dictatorship ended in 1983. And in 1983, the president, Raúl Alfonsín, started trials against the people who committed crimes during the dictatorship and publicized a National Truth Commission, or organized it. The government doesn't actually do the investigating, it's external people. But the point here is that this happened 1 year after the dictatorship ended. This was in the first administration. And in Brazil, it took over 2 decades to get just to the point of having a truth commission. Now, there are different theories as to why that's the case and why that happened. One of them is the question of how a government transitioned from dictatorship to democracy. So, what happened in Argentina was what is called a transition by collapse. The Argentinian military dictatorship had a lot of internal divisions. There were a lot of conflicts within the military regime, and it also recently decided to go to war with the UK over the Falkland Islands, possibly not the best strategic choice. And as such, the dictatorship totally collapsed, right? And the next government that came in, that was democratically elected, was independent from the military. It wasn't connected with the military. But he wasn't from the opposition of the dictatorship, he was more from like the centrist party. But because of that, he had a certain amount of independence from the military interests. He had some pressure from the military, certainly, but he also had pressure from the other side, saying, we want to actually talk about this. And because of that, he had the freedom and the flexibility to discuss and publicize what happened. So those trials and the Truth Commission were widely distributed. The trials were on public television. In Brazil, we have what we call an agreed transition. An agreed transition from a dictatorship to a democracy is when the dictatorship itself plans the democracy that will come next. And that's what happened. So the dictatorship knew they were going to transition to democracy. They set the terms. For example, the 1979 amnesty law, right? Which is a very important law that both it gave amnesty to political prisoners who were leftist political prisoners at the time, but it also gave amnesty to anyone in the military regime who had committed a political crime, right? And that law still holds today under democracy. What does that mean? It means that basically the dictatorship planned to be here, and there's also a lot of more evidence as to why that is, but it's an example of how a law from the dictatorship time holds today, which is something that would never happen in Argentina. Those laws don't have the same kind of continuity. So that makes a really difficult situation for memory, because in 20 years, documents can disappear, right? Things can be burned. Actually, it's very relevant to know that a lot of the documents related to the dictatorship functioning here at Well were burned. And there are lots of newspaper articles that talk about the burning of those documents in the early 1990s. So that's a context of forgetting. But in that context, art plays an interesting and important role. This is a book that I also have here, which is really cool, recently published. It was published in 2016. It's called Depois da Rua Tutoia. It's by a writer and journalist named Eduardo Lina. Brazilian. Eduardo Lina did a very interesting thing. He decided to write a fictional novel about something that he suspected happened in Brazil, but that he had no evidence for. So he wrote fiction about it. Now, this novel was about the disappearance of babies during the dictatorship. So we know that this happened in Argentina, and in Chile, and in Bolivia, and in Paraguay, and in Uruguay. But we have no documentation that this happened in Brazil. It's when, there's a child of a political prisoner, right? The person's a political prisoner, what do you do with the baby? We have all these cases in Argentina where those children were given to supporters of the regime, right? No documentation of this happening here. He writes this fictional novel about it, publishes it, and suddenly people start coming forward. And actually, a woman started with one person, got into contact with him, and said, I think it happened to my mom. I think my mom was one of those babies who was kidnapped during the dictatorship. Can you help me investigate this? And literally, he as a journalist, went and started investigating what happened. And in 1 year, he found 19 cases of children who had been kidnapped by the dictatorship that are not in the National Truth Commission. So what that means is that there are some aspects of the memory related to the dictatorship that are extremely marginal. right? They're not widely known, they're not widely publicized. And the power of art is that it gets to conjure up those memories. By imagining these histories of what might have happened and delving into those marginal histories through art, you can actually dig up real stories of what took place. So I recently interviewed Eduardo for the blog of the magazine, and it was just an insane experience that I think really captures exactly why this is important. Eventually, the people who were first-hand witnesses of these events, will just, they'll die, and then these histories will be totally lost. And I wanted to include this photo because I want to emphasize, I sort of mentioned this already, but I want to emphasize why this is relevant to WELL also, to here this university. This is a photo of one of the provosts of the university, the Heitor, here in the early 1970s, and two members of the Brazilian Armed Forces looking at the map of WELL, right? So the provost of this university was talking to the dictatorship, communicating with them, planning with them. That happened. That was in this institution where we are standing right now. In this photo, I actually saw it for the first time because the professors union here on campus published a pamphlet about the dangers of letting the military police back into campus, which is one of the major debates that has been going on. So if you don't remember this time period, you have the danger of letting things happen again, or not noticing that they already are happening again. And on that note, I kind of want to ask you guys before we go into questions, do you guys know of any artists or kinds of art that witness state violence today? I want to just hear some anything that you guys think is relevant. Any artists who witness state violence today? None? Zero?
Alive?
Alive. What are people doing today? What are artists doing today to witness state violence?
Think about Brazilian funk, for example.
Yeah.
Appeal, cheaper benefits, like clients, like funds, right? So that's a kind of state violence.
Yes.
Right?
That's like criminalization and censorship, totally. The criminalization and censorship of funky is 100% relevant. And in a lot of ways, people who are making funky music are witnessing the situation of their communities, right? Right? That's like a really powerful kind of art. And there's a lot of efforts to censor it. Any other ideas? For museum, or a specific artist in the museum whose artwork was displayed.
Yeah, they want to exhibit on LGBT history and LGBT art.
Yes.
Which was also censored.
Yes.
So that it was closed.
Exactly. So definitely censorship of LGBTQ issues and LGBTQ art, which also has that direct tie to the dictatorship because the dictatorship had moral censorship in addition to political censorship. So that's certainly very relevant. Anyone else? There are lots. Lots of people are doing really cool stuff right now to talk about what's going on. I brought in another example just because these are like the few books that I have here. Since I'm traveling, I can't have too many. But this book is called Diário da Cadeia, com trechos da obra inédita Impeachment. Has anyone heard of it? It's really good, I recommend it. Look at who it's signed by. Eduardo Cunha, pseudonym. This is a novel, a fictional novel, that an author published using Eduardo Cunha as a pseudonym. And it's from the perspective of Eduardo Cunha from him. And it's really hilarious and amazing critique of what's going on, and then there was a whole lawsuit that ensued from it. So now we know that the actual author is Ricardo Iglesias, and Ricardo Iglesias is a little bit angry about the fact that his video was exposed. But I'll also pass around these books for you guys to see and take a look at. So, I think I wanted to end on this question because I think the most important part of what I'm trying to say to you guys today is that this is an ongoing issue. The silencing of witnessing has not ended with the dictatorship. Also, it hasn't ended in the United States. Authoritarianism can exist in its official form, or it can slip into democracies and really take away a lot of people's freedoms. And so, in that context, art is really, really important in exposing what's going on. And it's very relevant and important today as well. So, now I'd love to hear any questions or comments or thoughts that you guys have. And thank you guys for listening.